So I think with that, we can then talk about, I suppose, this is the B-side to the episode, where we're going to be discussing, I guess the topic of conversation based on Boot Hill is, when is an RPG an RPG? What is the RP in RPG?
I think that is a really great question, and Boot Hill makes you ask it. It is a skirmish game in terms of your verb set, in terms of your interactions with you and the other players. Like, it's what you do in a skirmish game. But you do get one level closer to the individual.
Yeah.
The game even refers to it as a player character. So you are actually taking a POV in the action, and you're going to be the specific character. And for me, when you're getting into an RPG is when you're getting into the question of motivation. And I think that comes into this game, especially in campaign play.
So can you give me a sort of an example about how that would be not true of a war game? Not true in the same sense. Obviously, there are war games that have role-playing elements, but
100%. Like, let's talk about a World War II game. If you're like a company commander, it's not really about your motivation. It's about your orders and your objectives, and that determines the actions and the way that you're going to navigate the game space. It's going to be based on those factors, not exclusively, but much, much less the factors of individual temperament and disposition. And in this game, in Boot Hill, and in other Wild West games, I'm sure, you really do get to get in the saddle, if you pardon the pun, and experience the character from that much more intimate perspective. And I think that is where this game is not confused, but it's undefined in how much of a role-playing game it is.
Yeah, I think in some cases, like, there are games more recently made that it might be said that they can't decide what they are being. But I think in this case, because of when it was made and how it feels, that seems to be more of just a lack of definition, or these different emergent properties of the game haven't sorted themselves out yet. And yeah, there's just certain key things where there's something that I could identify as being a role-playing game. Like, for instance, we are described as having a player character, and then we are also in control of non-player characters. So that implies a protagonist, because they don't call them a leader. They call them a player character in Boot Hill. And there's maybe not a well-defined implication behind that, at least at the time, but there it is, the suggestion that it's like, this is your guy. This is your representation.
Yep.
The main character of your posse. And then, as I said, but then that's sort of counterbalanced by the fact that all of the ability scores for this game are combat focused.
Yes, exactly. Like, the game definitely knows what it wants you to be doing with your time while you're playing it. And even the way that it describes a campaign is to get those tabletop scenarios in action.
It's sort of a way to string together a series of encounters
and make them more meaningful and impactful, both individually and in their greater, shared context. But it's interesting that it is a gunfighting game first and foremost. It knows it, it wants it, and I think that is some of the core fantasy that it fulfills.
Yeah, and as I was mentioning about what I had learned in researching the history of the game, the existence of Western gunfight suggests that property of that scale of game, I don't think it's something that's necessarily akin to just Western games, but the scenario that comes to mind for a gang of guys confronting another gang of guys, and we're talking about, like small numbers, is the Western. That's the archetypical thing. It automatically suggests this sort of familiarity, like you have these named characters that have these personalities that you can tie to them,
Yeah.
You have your Wyatt Earps and Doc Hollidays.
Well, even in the way that everyone has different attributes, that helps you understand them as different characters. But because they're individuals, what happens to them on the tabletop, you might set apart and remember as distinct. Like,
Right.
this guy is a coward because he always fails his bravery checks. You know what I mean? Like, just the behavior of the model will, through chance, inform your expectations and ideas on that character. And that's in addition to them having stats and having whatever you project onto them. There's also just the dice making stuff up as they go.
Yeah, so I don't necessarily think that Western Gunfight is, because there is some claim it's like, oh, this is like the first role-playing game. And I'm like, in as much as the Brownstein games were role-playing games, it was more of an emergent quality of playing that scale,
yeah,
and having that level of intimacy with the characters that allows our human imagination to then tell a story about it. And it's not a huge leap to go from that to controlling one character and then the story is about that experience.
I find the focus on the individual in a role-playing campaign really refreshing to me, as I predominantly am a wargamer. So being able to see a game that splices it all together is really cool. You know, it gives you both.
Yeah, and there's an interesting idea about how you play cooperatively. Like, if you've got, say you wanted to run a table of this or a campaign with multiple players. Okay, so you've got a player character for each of them, but then do they also have subordinates as well? And that would be in line with the older way of playing Dungeons and Dragons, because a lot of the defining quality behind that game is still this sort of idea that you have a cloud of not lesser characters,
Hirelings.
but hirelings. Yeah, that's the specific word used in the rules.
Yep.
That one character is almost like a mini party that joins up with other mini, like there's almost a hierarchy within that, and there's a suggestion of being like shared between, like, oh, we as a group hired these guys and I will tell that person what. And there's, I guess, what you would call what might be called player to GM governance. Like, does the GM control the NPCs, or do you let the players directly control them? Or if you do both, at what time do those things happen?
Yeah, totally. Like, only if they fail a morale check does the GM control them. Otherwise, all types of ways you can handle it.
Sure. Or the one that I was thinking of is the players only control them in combat, but not outside of combat.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So, like, even between us, just thinking there, we're like, oh, but it's funny because I don't know any role playing, and I don't know. I'll get to that point after I make this first one. I don't know any role playing game of that era or with that mindset that even addresses that aspect. I think there's an assumption that you'll just sort of sort it out in some way. And the point that I was going to make after that is, I don't know that you should. I think that is kind of the folk tradition of role-playing games, is not all the rules are necessarily explained completely. I know there are systems that do that. And I'm sure one day we will get on to talking about those. And I have no shade on them. They do what they do very well. But I think it does bring up the point that you don't have to state everything in a rule set in order to trust that people are going to find a way to govern it themselves for their own table.
Yes. It's almost like not putting the onus of house ruling on the players, but expecting that players will have a natural preference and order of going about what you present to them.
Yeah. And so to go back around to like, okay, well, when is it an RPG? And yeah, I think it's that characterization. It's when I start thinking about what are the motivations behind my character's actions. Like, a gratuitous example of that would be, I'm not concerned about what it means when my bishop takes a pawn in chess. Like, I'm not thinking about what the bishop's thinking. Like, why that pawn? And who am I defending by doing this? I mean, it's implied because obviously you want your side to win, but they're just symbols. And war games come out of that mindset.
Yes.
There is a sort of you are you kind of framing where I, as the player, am the military commander. But there's also a level of gamist abstraction on that, because the actual military commander isn't a gigantic man that floats over the table.
And also decides all these information. Yeah.
Yeah. And like, I'm just giving it the framing of, like, people playing, like, military commanders playing Kriegspiel. And it's like, well, obviously I have a vantage point that I wouldn't normally have, but within that abstraction, there's a certain amount of realism. That's why I always find simulationist systems to be a little bit odd. Aside from creating a simulation of life, what is the objective of creating that system? That's like, there are some games that definitely dig into an aggressive level of detail to try and simulate things for good or ill.
100%. There's like Advanced Squad Leader is such a classic. Like, hey, let's throw everything we can in here.
Yeah, exactly. The hero system, I don't know if you're familiar with that.
Okay.
In role playing is very granular, and it's debatable whether that's valued. But even like a system like GURPS, where the rule system is easy to interpret, but then the number of additional rules that can be plugged into that can go beyond any scope. But I think that, yeah, behind all of those different mechanical choices, the thing that makes a role-playing game is the role-playing.
Yes, 100%.
Yeah, you're pretending to be whoever that is to a greater or lesser extent. Like, for instance, you might relate more to, for the example of Boot Hill, your player character may be the one that you're really thinking about the internal motivations of, and you might give some consideration to the other members of your gang. But it's still, it's in the cards, right?
Yeah, and you would be thinking about your player character, their role in the posse, their wants, why they're trying to stick up this train, you know, some of the things that you would do in that game. So yeah, I don't know. I really like the early moments where these skirmish games put on the mantle of being an RPG, because it's still a fun skirmish game, but then you get the meat of an actual role-playing game growing out of it.
Yeah, it's a battle game with a RPG mindset. So that's why I don't discount Boot Hill in that sense.
Yeah, totally.
And, you know, if we ever get around to looking at second and third edition, they very much make it like a role-playing game. It's a role-playing game where you can die instantly, which, well, the old school nature of that being what it is, you're not precious about your characters, but you act like it's a very weird ask, especially of modern players, where it's like, I want you to fully invest in playing this named character who you may have, you know, thought up or rolled up, and then they just get killed in the next fight, like right away. And I think with the right mindset, I'm okay with that. Certainly randomly rolling up a character makes it so that you don't feel like you've overinvested, and as you play, the character is uncovered gradually. And if they die, then that's their story.
Yes.
It actually lends a lot to random character generation, which, you know, I don't know that it's that popular nowadays, considering how bespoke and how many character options you have in games like D&D 5e, but that's a way of doing things.
It is. Yeah, man, this was a really cool game to read. I really found myself inspired by the setting and the potential space of this game, and it's got me thinking like we were saying earlier, like we could see ourselves gaming in this, you know? Maybe we wouldn't use everything that we have presented to us in this original first edition, but I think what this first edition hints at and managed to achieve is quite notable.
Yeah, it definitely is sort of like, wow, you know, I think this is, I mean, there's certain things about the historical setting of the Wild West that some people might have difficulty with, either through knowledge or temperament or mindset getting into. It is a complicated time, but there is a sort of lighter, more contained fantasy element. You don't have to necessarily play it historically. So, and whatever that element is clearly evocative. I mean, it's in everything from the sort of frontier wilderness of Conan all the way to the weird planets in the original Star Trek series, or even just the mindset of going out there and, you know, exploring those places. So yeah, that is the game. And Yeah, Troy, what do we got coming up for the next episode?
So next week we are going back into RPGs in a very direct, literal way with the Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay First Edition. So it looks like a war game from the outside if you read the labels, but when you get in there, it is a crunchy, serious role-playing game, and it's the start of Warhammer as a setting as we know it. So it'll be really fun to deep dive into, and we'll be sure to give you guys our preferred breakdown as we go through sort of a bit of the history, a bit of the game, a bit of the impact. And once you've heard it from us, I'm sure you'll be looking for it on drive-thru.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, then. We'll call that a show.